Welcome, my friends, to the very beginning of the American story. Before there were cities, before there were presidents, before there were even nations on this land, there were only ice, endless wilderness, and people moving across a world that looked nothing like the one we know today. Tonight, we are traveling back more than 20,000 years into the past, to the final ice age, to discover how the very first humans set foot in the Americas. This is the prologue to everything that comes after: the rise of civilizations, the conflicts, the revolutions, and the birth of the United States. To truly understand America, we need to start at the very beginning, with the first footsteps across a land bridge that no longer exists. Imagine Earth 20,000 years ago. The planet was in the grip of the last glacial maximum. Enormous sheets of ice stretched over Canada, the northern United States, Scandinavia, and Siberia. These glaciers were miles thick, so heavy that they pressed the land beneath them. The world was colder, drier, and harsher. Because so much water was locked up in ice, global sea levels were dramatically lower, about 300 feet lower than today. This change exposed entire land masses that are now hidden beneath the ocean. One of these was the vast plain we call Beringia. Beringia wasn't just a narrow strip of land. It was a massive region, sometimes as wide as 600 miles, stretching between Siberia and Alaska. Today, the Bering Strait is a frigid channel of water. But during the Ice Age, it was dry land, covered in grasslands and tundra, teeming with animals: mammoths, steppe bison, caribou, horses, and even predators like saber-toothed cats and giant short-faced bears. For humans, Beringia was both a bridge and a home. It was not just something to cross, it was a place where families lived, hunted, and adapted for thousands of years. So who were the first Americans? Archaeologists and geneticists tell us that their ancestors came from Asia. These people were hunter-gatherers who had spread across Siberia, following the great herds. They were skilled toolmakers, creating sharp blades and spear points from stone. They built shelters out of animal bones and hides, used fire to survive in the brutal cold, and lived in small, mobile bands. For them, survival meant constant movement. When the great herds moved, the people followed. And eventually, those herds began to wander eastward, onto the grasslands of Beringia. The hunters followed, step by step, without any idea that they were entering a completely new continent. Beringia itself was not frozen wasteland, as one might imagine. Because of its unique climate, it was actually a cold but habitable steppe, sometimes called the Mammoth Steppe. Here, grasses and herbs grew in abundance, supporting vast populations of grazing animals. For humans, this meant food, clothing, tools, and fuel. A mammoth could provide meat for weeks, hides for tents and clothing, bones for building structures, and fat for lamps. Archaeological evidence suggests that people may have lived in Beringia for thousands of years, forming what some scientists call a Beringian standstill. Genetic studies of Native American DNA show signs that their ancestors were isolated in this region for perhaps 5,000 years before spreading further into the Americas. Think about that, whole generations living on a land bridge between two worlds, not knowing they were the ancestors of entire nations to come. Eventually, as the Ice Age began to loosen its grip, two great ice sheets in North America, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, started to retreat. This opened up corridors through the ice, allowing humans to move south into the heart of the continent. One theory says that people traveled through an ice-free corridor between these glaciers, moving down into what is now Canada and the Great Plains. Another theory argues that some groups may have followed the Pacific coastline, using boats or traveling along the shorelines, exploiting rich marine resources. Whichever path they took, by around 15,000 years ago, humans had spread widely across the Americas. Archaeological sites from Chile to Pennsylvania prove that people adapted quickly to different environments: deserts, mountains, forests, and coasts. For decades, archaeologists believed that the earliest culture in the Americas was the Clovis culture, named after distinctive stone spear points first found near Clovis, New Mexico. These tools, with their elegant fluted shape, date back about 13,000 years and were once thought to represent the very first Americans. But new discoveries challenge that story. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft Rockshelter in Pennsylvania, and Bluefish caves in Canada suggest that people were here thousands of years earlier. This has forced scientists to rethink everything. It now seems likely that the first Americans arrived at least 15,000 years ago, maybe even earlier. Why does this matter? Because the story of the first Americans is the story of all of us. It's about courage, survival, and adaptation. It's about people who left behind the familiar and ventured into the unknown. Every civilization in the Americas, from the Maya and the Inca to the Sioux and the Iroquois, ultimately traces its roots back to these first migrants across Beringia. Without them, there would be no American history. In this first part, we've seen how the Ice Age created the conditions for human migration, how Beringia became both bridge and homeland, and how the first steps were taken into the Americas. But this is only the beginning of our story. In the next part, we will follow these first Americans deeper into the continent. We'll explore their tools, their survival strategies, and the great migrations that carried them from Alaska to the tip of South America. So stay with me, because the journey of the first Americans has only just begun. Part 2. In this part, we dive into the archaeology, the stones, the bones, and the artifacts that whisper the story of the first Americans. For a long time, the narrative of the first Americans was dominated by a single culture, the Clovis people. In the 1920s and 1930s, archaeologists in New Mexico uncovered remarkable spear points, finely crafted with a distinctive groove, or flute, running up the base. These tools were unlike anything seen before, perfectly balanced for hunting large animals. Clovis points were soon discovered all across North America, from Texas to Pennsylvania, from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains. Radiocarbon dating placed them around 13,000 years ago. For decades, this became the Clovis first model, the belief that the Clovis culture represented the very first human presence in the Americas. It was a neat story. Elegant tools, spread across an entire continent, at just the right time after the retreat of the glaciers. But as often happens in science, new discoveries complicated the picture. In Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, archaeologists found evidence of human settlement dating back nearly 15,000 years. This included wooden structures, hearths, and tools, all older than Clovis. In Pennsylvania, the Meadowcroft Rockshelter yielded stone tools that some argue are at least 16,000 years old. In Canada's Yukon Territory, the Bluefish caves revealed butchered animal bones with cut marks possibly dating back more than 20,000 years. If these dates are correct, it means people were living in the Americas thousands of years before Clovis. The Clovis first model began to crumble. Today, most archaeologists accept that Clovis was not the beginning, but rather one chapter in a much older and more complex story. The tools of these early peoples reveal their skill and adaptability. Stone was their lifeline, used for knives, scrapers, drills, and spear tips. In North America, different cultures developed distinct tool-making traditions. Some relied on large fluted points like Clovis. Others used smaller, more versatile blades. On the Pacific coast, people crafted fishing tools, hooks, and net weights. Each toolkit reflects adaptation to a specific environment. In the tundra of Alaska, survival meant hunting caribou and mammoth. Along the coasts, people gathered shellfish, fished, and hunted seals. In the grasslands, they pursued bison and horses. What emerges is a picture of remarkable flexibility. These were not primitive wanderers, they were resourceful innovators, shaping their tools to match the land around them. But tools and bones tell only part of the story. What about culture? What about belief? Though direct evidence is scarce, archaeologists find hints of spirituality. Burials, for example, suggest ritual and respect for the dead. In some sites, bodies were laid carefully, accompanied by tools or ornaments. This implies a belief in an afterlife or the importance of honoring ancestors. Rock art provides another window. Though many petroglyphs and pictographs are much younger than the first migrations, they carry echoes of ancient traditions, animals, spirits, celestial symbols. We cannot know exactly what the first Americans believed. But we can imagine that, like all human beings, they sought to explain the world around them, the stars above, the storms, the animals that gave them life. Their myths and stories have been lost, but their descendants, the native nations of the Americas, preserve traditions that may carry fragments of that original worldview. For decades, the dominant idea was that all first Americans came across the Bering Land Bridge. But what if there were other routes? One theory is the Pacific coastal route. According to this view, early people may have traveled along the shoreline of the Pacific, using boats or hugging the coasts. This would explain how humans reached South America so quickly after entering the continent. The ocean offered rich resources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and kelp forests. Another controversial idea is the Solutrean hypothesis. This suggests that people from Ice Age Europe, specifically the Solutrean culture of Spain and France, may have crossed the Atlantic on the ice edge. Proponents point to similarities between Solutrean tools and Clovis points. However, most scholars reject this theory, arguing the evidence is weak and that genetics clearly link Native Americans to Asia, not Europe. And then there are connections to Polynesia. Some argue that early seafarers could have reached South America long before Europeans. In fact, the presence of the sweet potato, a South American plant, in Polynesia centuries before Columbus shows that contact between the regions did occur at some point. While these theories spark debate, the strongest evidence still points to Asia and Beringia as the primary origin of the first Americans. But the full story may be far more complex than a single migration. In recent years, genetics has added powerful new evidence. By studying the DNA of Native American populations, scientists have traced their ancestry back to a common group in Siberia. This genetic data shows a Beringian standstill, meaning that the ancestors of Native Americans lived in isolation in Beringia for thousands of years before moving into the Americas. This aligns with archaeological evidence that people made a home there, not just passed through. Genetics also reveal that there were multiple waves of migration. Most Native Americans descend from the first wave, but later groups, like the Inuit and Aleut, arrived much more recently, adapted for Arctic life. So the story of American origins is not a single line, it is a braided river, with different streams of people arriving at different times. Each new discovery reshapes our understanding of human history. The Americas were not an untouched wilderness waiting for discovery, they were lands explored, settled, and transformed by human beings long before Columbus, long before Jamestown, long before the birth of the United States. The first Americans were pioneers of survival, adapting to ice and desert, forest and mountain, sea and plain. Their descendants built civilizations that would rise and fall long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. In this part, we explored the evidence left behind, the stone points, the bones, the shelters, and the DNA that ties it all together. We saw how the Clovis myth gave way to a richer, older story, and how multiple theories paint a picture of migration more complex than we once imagined. But we are not done yet. In the final part of this journey, we will follow the first Americans deeper into the continent. We'll look at how they spread across North and South America, the environments they conquered, the megafauna they hunted, and what happened when those giant animals began to disappear. Stay tuned, because the saga of the first Americans is about to reach its climax. Part 3. In Part 3, we will follow those first Americans as they spread across the continent. We'll witness how they adapted to every imaginable environment, how they hunted the great beasts of the Ice Age, and how their way of life set the stage for the civilizations that would come later. Once humans crossed into Alaska, they didn't stay put. They moved, steadily, generation after generation. Within just a few thousand years, humans had spread from the Arctic Circle all the way to the tip of South America. Think about that. From frozen tundra to tropical rainforests, from deserts to high mountain ranges, these people adapted to every kind of landscape on Earth's most diverse continent. Archaeological sites show us this incredible expansion. In Brazil, stone tools at Pedra Furada may be over 12,000 years old. In Chile, the Monte Verde site shows human presence nearly 15,000 years ago. By 11,000 years ago, people were living across nearly every region of the Americas. It was one of the greatest migrations in human history. As people spread, they carried with them the knowledge and skills of hunters and gatherers. But each environment demanded unique solutions. In the Arctic and subarctic, survival meant hunting caribou, elk, and mammoth, building shelters from snow and hides, and storing food for long winters. In the Great Plains, people followed massive herds of bison. They became experts at driving these animals into traps or over cliffs, a dangerous but effective way to secure food for entire communities. Along the coasts, people turned to the sea. They collected shellfish, fished in rivers, and hunted seals and sea lions. The Pacific Northwest, with its rich salmon runs, became one of the most bountiful regions. In the tropical forests of Central and South America, people gathered fruits, roots, and medicinal plants, supplementing their diets with small game and fish. Everywhere they went, humans proved their resilience and creativity. But the world these first Americans entered was not the same as today. They encountered a land filled with giants, what scientists call megafauna. Imagine standing face to face with a towering mammoth, or hunting a massive ground sloth as big as a car. North America was home to giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and even the fearsome short-faced bear, one of the largest carnivores ever to walk the earth. For the first Americans, these animals were both a blessing and a challenge. They provided enormous amounts of meat, hides, and bones, but hunting them required cooperation, strategy, and bravery. A single mammoth hunt could feed a band for weeks, even months. The tools of the Clovis people, those elegant fluted points, were perfectly designed for piercing the hides of these massive creatures. Archaeological sites show mammoth skeletons marked with human tools, frozen moments of ancient hunts. And yet, within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of these giants were gone. By about 10,000 years ago, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and many others had vanished. Why? Scientists debate two main causes. One is climate change. As the Ice Age ended, habitats shifted. The grasslands that supported mammoths gave way to forests. Warmer temperatures changed ecosystems. The second cause is human hunting. Some researchers argue that the arrival of skilled hunters tipped the balance. Even small bands of people, armed with sharp weapons and cooperative strategies, could have driven vulnerable populations of megafauna to extinction. Most likely, it was a combination of both. Climate stressed the populations, and humans delivered the final blow. The extinction of the megafauna transformed life for the first Americans. Without mammoths and other giants, they turned to smaller game, bison, deer, fish, and plants. This shift marked the beginning of new ways of living. As the megafauna disappeared, the first Americans adapted again. They became more inventive in their use of resources. They developed grinding stones to process seeds and roots. They wove baskets, created nets, and fashioned new tools for fishing and trapping. Settlements grew larger and more permanent in fertile regions. This period laid the foundation for the rise of agriculture. In Mesoamerica, people eventually domesticated maize, beans, and squash, crops that would become staples for civilizations like the Maya and Aztec. In South America, potatoes and quinoa were cultivated high in the Andes, supporting the future Inca Empire. The story of the first Americans is not only about survival. It is about transformation, the gradual shift from wandering hunters to builders of villages, towns, and eventually empires. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from White Sands, New Mexico. Here, scientists discovered human footprints preserved in ancient mud, dating back nearly 23,000 years. These footprints tell us that humans were in North America far earlier than once believed. Even more, they show us the human side of history. Some tracks are of children running and playing. Others show adults carrying loads. One trail even records someone walking with a child on their hip. In those prints, frozen in time, we can almost see their lives, not just as hunters or migrants, but as families, as people like us. The descendants of these pioneers would go on to create incredible cultures. The mound builders of North America, the intricate societies of the Maya and Inca, the vast trade networks that connected coast to coast, all trace back to those first bands who crossed into Beringia. The journey of the first Americans reminds us of the endurance of humanity. Across ice and fire, through extinctions and transformations, people adapted, thrived, and built the foundations of the world we know today. So now we have the full arc of the story. In Part 1, we saw the Ice Age and the Bridge of Beringia. In Part 2, we uncovered the evidence, the tools, the DNA, and the debates. And in Part 3, we followed the expansion across the Americas, the fall of the megafauna, and the beginnings of culture. The first Americans were not just wanderers. They were survivors, innovators, and visionaries. Their footsteps echo across thousands of years, shaping the destiny of a continent. And this is where our story of America truly begins. So, the first people came to America thanks to the Ice Age and the land bridge that connected two continents. They didn't set out to conquer a new world, they simply followed the herds they depended on. And from them begins the story of all the civilizations of the New World. In our next episode, we'll talk about the great civilizations that appeared much later, the Maya, the Inca, and the Aztec. Thank you for traveling with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the first people could have reached America by sea?